Yeah, little.
Jim and I are kind of the
Exactly.
same.
I can't sit anywhere
We always
right
have
here.
our seats.
Okay,
Yeah.
seriously.
I can't sit anywhere else. Hi, everybody. Welcome, welcome. Happy Thursday. Yeah, it's a Thursday. Welcome to our May Housing Solutions Advisory Council. Great to see everybody online and those in the room. Thank you for coming. We do appreciate it. We have a great agenda and gonna hear about a lot of good stuff, but we will first start with our public comment. There is public comments submitted, which has been posted on the agenda and available for all of you to read. Chair and Vice Chair Drew and I are taking all public comments into our standing debrief meeting with county staff to discuss how to address the comments on a case-by-case basis. So when we get a public comment, it is sent to us and then we figure out how we want ultimately staff to respond. That kind of happens offline, but it is happening. So any public comment that comes in, we do make sure to respond to. And then we have an opportunity now for a public comment. I know we have one online, one in-house, and then is there anybody online? Sorry, Nadia, I keep looking at you.
No comments on
Perfect. So we'll go over here for you, sir.
that. All right, Rigoberto Lopez, Assistant Director of Housing Services, and I'll just get into my public comment. I know I keep coming into these spaces vocalizing the importance of focusing on system optimization, but I also want to acknowledge something I've been talking a lot about is the need of change without offering viable solutions in the moment. And honestly, I've been reflecting on that. In some ways, I've realized that I've been gatekeeping what I know, not intentionally, but even withholding tools, ideas, and examples can become a form of waste, and it's really, and I really believe in what Kaizen teaches us. Every part of the system can be improved. I need to model that by sharing more of what I learned, not just naming what needs to be changed. So today I want to stop holding back and start offering tangible reflections of what I believe can help this system evolve. Yesterday, I was at the Tri-County Planning Body meeting, and there is something I forgot to mention, honestly, in the moment got to me, and I'm still trying to figure out my voice in this space. Public speaking is not my greatest strength, but in the spirit of continuous improvement, I try to lean into the discomfort because growth lives there. What I didn't get to say is how important I believe in regionalization. Right now, we have 3 counties offering similar core services, but very different results. Washington County has built an incredible system. It's inspiring to see, hats off to everyone involved, but even so, there's still work to be done to fully optimize the system. Yesterday, I briefly shared my background in systems optimization, specifically through the lens of Kaizen. Over my years in manufacturing, I've acquired a very particular set of skills that make an immediate problem for waste. I'm always alert, always watching for inefficiencies, whether it's wasted time, effort, miscommunication, or duplications. I can't help but see what's added value and what's not. In the spirit, I've also brought out a handout with a brief overview of Kaizen principles and the benefits it brings. At Central, we're currently doing a value stream mapping, a deep dive into our systems to identify inefficiencies and drive higher delivery of service. This is not to gatekeep, this is to pilot and then at some point share out to everybody. This is why I see regionalizations not just as a structural shift, but also an opportunity to break down silos, align tools, and approach service delivery as one unified system. Most of what we do at our core is the same, but we're doing it in 3 different ways with 3 different system tools and processes. That's a huge source of waste. And at the end, it's our participants who feel the friction. Zooming out another layer, we see same things with service provider, many doing similar work, but widely varying results. The time for serious optimization strategies is now, especially with the funding challenges we know are coming. Kaizen isn't just a theory, it's a tangible, proven way to make our systems leaner, smarter, and more responsive. And it only works if we do it together. I gave a presentation on Kaizen to my staff when I first started, once I got promoted. If folks are interested, I'd be happy to host a session of Kaizen and you guys can come over to Central and we can do a presentation. I'm also looking for community partners to do a value stream mapping. The handout that I have will have details on that. Let's keep learning from each other, break the silos, drop the gatekeeping, and keep continuing together.
Great. And everyone will get the handout.
Good.
Perfect. Any public comment online, Martin?
No public comments online.
Perfect, thank you so much. Next up is our point in time count results, and we're gonna go to staff. Some staff.
Thanks, yeah, actually Heather is here with us. So I have no introduction except gratitude, because Heather has led us in partnership with the 3 counties and our consultant through this very complex data work over the last several years, in fact, but especially since January, when the point in time count was conducted. So with gratitude to Heather, passing the baton over to you.
Hey, apologies. Someone called me on my personal cell phone right as I was about to talk, so I had to get my volume down. Hi, everyone. I'm here to talk about the point in time count. And I'll just give a little bit of history first before we start diving into our results. The point in time count, also known as the PIT, is an annual HUD report that is required every year. It is a snapshot on a single night. HUD requires that it's within the last 10 days of January every year, of those that are homeless in the community. For 2025, our point in time count took place on January 23rd, 2025, which was the same night in alignment with our regional partners. The point in time count has 2 components. The first is a sheltered count. So that is everyone who is staying in either a shelter or a transitional housing bed in the county, and that is measured through HMIS data. And then the second part is the street count, also known as the unsheltered count. And that is where we get an army of volunteers to go out and try to survey people in the community and identify who is homeless. Participation in the street count is optional. And we often find that we get very limited data back from those survey questions. The street count the shelter count is required every single year by HUD. The street count is optional, and it needs to happen at least every other year. And so one thing you'll note as we are talking about these charts is that we did not complete a street count in 2024 because of wanting to be in alignment with our regional partners. Okay, so looking at the overall trends, first of all, draw attention to the graph. The very top bar is our total count, and you can see how that has been increasing since 2020. The dark blue line is the sheltered count. The brown line is unsheltered, and then the dotted light blue line is our chronic homeless count, and that is the subset of everyone else. So what we can see in this is that our sheltered individuals make up the vast majority of our count, and that really is a reflection of the amount of shelter capacity we have been able to add into our system due to the Supportive Housing Services bond. And you can kind of see where that impact started making a big difference in our point in time count in 2022 after we had started the launch of SHS shelters in 2021. Unsheltered homelessness has remained stable since 2022. We've been pretty flat in terms of how many people we're finding in our street count since the launch of our shelter system. We are seeing that chronic homelessness is increasing. It's increased a significant amount year over year. Go to the next slide. We can talk a little bit more about that chronic homeless population though. Chronic homelessness is increasing kind of in spite of all of the wonderful work our county is doing. This slide is talking about how the chronically homeless populations in our 2023 count and then our 2024 count, and then where are they as of this year's point in time count. And what we can see here is that 65% of the people in our 2023 shelter count who were chronically homeless are now housed. And then for 2024, 69% of those who were in our shelter count who were chronically homeless, they are also now housed. Which if we look into our next slide leads us to the other observation that while we saw an increase in chronic homelessness, this is a reflection of newly chronically homeless in our community. Only 19% of the people who were flagged as chronically homeless in our 2025 count were even counted in a prior point in time count. Next slide. We'll just take a quick look at how the point in time count looks from a household demographics. You can see that the vast majority of the individuals in these homeless families are in adult-only households, though there are still a very significant number of adult and child households. And that is actually the one that has probably increased the most as a proportion since 2020. And we continue to see a handful of child-only households that are experiencing homelessness, but it has been always a pretty small portion of the overall count. All right, now looking at how do people, what are the racial identities of those who are homeless? One thing that we know about the point in time count is that it is generally an undercount. It is partially just because we're looking at a snapshot. It's also because we don't count people who are involuntarily doubled up and couch surfing and those who kind of move in and out of homelessness. And our culturally specific providers have indicated to us that there's a lack of representation in the point in time count as a result. And I think this chart really demonstrates that. And it's most prominent in the Latinate population. We know that the Latinate population makes up about 20% of the population in poverty in Washington County, and yet they made up 22% of the population that we recorded in the point in time count. Next slide. All right, so what are the takeaways here? We can definitely see the increase in our shelter capacity and how the point in time count has been rising. And we can also see that we've been seeing a huge increase in the people experiencing homelessness for the first time since 2020. That's been a 69% increase. And this is largely due to economic drivers. Inflation has been going up, wages are stagnant. We are able to be very successful in housing people, but this just underlies that there is a strong need to continue getting more resources, and the need for homeless services is outpacing what we have available to us. And some of the next steps that we're going to go from here is, one thing we're working on is creating what's called a by name list. Some people may be familiar with the Built for Zero methodology. A by name list is just, a list of everyone who is homeless in the county. We are working on pulling ours together, and then we're going to work to coordinate with our regional counterparts on a regional by name list. The HUD submission is the next step. The timing is actually now known. They opened it up this week, and we need to submit it by June 13th, and we'll be submitting it very soon. Anyone have
Awesome.
Okay, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say thank you, Heather, but yeah, we can open it up for any questions.
I have two hopefully quick questions, more of a learning thing. Does the PIT count include the people that are in the permanent supportive housing units, like in Hardwood Commons? Is that counted, or is that they're considered permanent?
They are not counted because they are housed, so they're not considered homeless at that moment.
And then I remember back when there was the LC3 thing going around, I thought that was gonna be the by name list. Okay, just wanted to clarify my.
I'll let Heather jump in.
Yeah.
This is our next slide.
Yeah, the LC3 was focused very much on encampments and those in outreach. The by name list is a lot more encompassing because it would include people who are in shelter. It will include people who outreach is working with, and it will include people who are on our coordinated entry wait list. So it's a little bit more expansive than the LC3 list was.
Thank you.
Yes, Jim.
I don't know if you can answer this, but have you been able to review the other counties' data, and are the trends that you see in your data reflective of what the other counties are seeing? Sorry.
That's okay.
Yeah.
I'm fine.
I myself haven't had a chance to review, but my sense is that our trends are similar. I don't know if anyone else in the room has seen the region.
Thanks, Heather. I'll step in to help. I have not seen all the regions. I know that I've coordinated with my peers in the other two counties to have this discussion, and the trends, the themes are the same. Homelessness is up and more people are getting served and moving through, and it's at both ends. There is different nuance in each of the counties. And then one thing I would add is a significant nuance, because actually, it's important because I think it's gonna be released tonight in, some media. That the Multnomah County approach to their data is really different. So as Heather described, we have a shelter count and a street count. There's also an option to add an administrative data count, if you will, everyone that you know you didn't count in either shelter or the street, but your HMIS data, your by name list, your LC3 list might tell you think for very good reasons they are also homeless in your county on that date, even though you couldn't find them in a shelter or the street in the PIC count process. So that is called admin data, and Multnomah County uses it, but the other two counties do not. And the reason we've not used it is because if you add in a bunch of extra data, you change the trend line, because now you can't compare this year's count to last year's count. Whereas Multnomah County has already done that in previous counts. So their point in time count is it is bigger, right? They have thousands of shelter beds, we have hundreds. They have thousands of unhoused people in their shelter count, or street count, but they also have thousands of folks that are added through their admin count. So it's an important distinction between how Clackamas and Washington County do their PIC counts versus Multnomah County. And this, you didn't ask this question, I'm just gonna keep on going and say that there's lots of disagreement and discussion over the years of the PIC count, because it's a flawed process required by HUD. It is just a snapshot in time. It is not a good way to actually know what the need is. This is why everyone's moving towards by name lists. And yet we still have to report it, media still got, like it is still a thing. So you have to be accountable to it and be able to describe it and use it. And so the way we've decided to use it is by describing it as, this is what's important is the trends we can see within our data. It's not that this is a full count of who we know is in need. It's like, what can we understand the data to be telling us when we watch it over time and look at the subpopulations within. Heather, is there anything you would add to all of that? I know we spent lots of time talking about it.
That covers it all.
Outside of just the racial demographics, I'm curious if there were like age demographics or things like sexual orientation, if possible. Like, is that data available as well?
We didn't look at it by age, but we could have. You kind of get that when you're looking at the adult child versus adult only versus child only composition. We do not have sexual orientation available as something we could report on. We do have gender and gender identity, but that is a little bit harder to know what it's telling us because we don't have a comparison population.
Sure, that makes sense, but the age is something that could be reported on, because one of the things that we're seeing in our case conferencing work is the age is skewing much higher than we would have necessarily thought it would, and so I'm just curious. I've heard anecdotally that the age of folks on the homelessness continuum is rising, and it would be kind of cool to see that in the data as well, if available.
Heather, is that data we have available at this time, or is that to come when there's further analysis?
We'd have to complete some further analysis. I mean, we have the raw data, but we haven't put together any analysis on it.
Great. Any other questions or comments? Awesome. Heather, thank you for being here. Thank you for explaining that to us and giving all of that information. Is there a request for that follow-up information coming from,
No.
would you like to see, I mean, we could. It could just be information that's shared with us via email.
Yeah, email would be great.
Okay, great. So we would love to see some of that follow-up data, if you could share it with us, Heather. So thank you. Awesome.
Heather, I happened to speak with Marisa Zapata today at HRAC, and I think a lot of data will be coming out because the Oregonian has been asking for the full data set. So by way of passing along a message to Heather and also sharing with everyone here. That data might be on the news tonight, Adam, but more to come soon.
Okay, we are gonna keep plugging along. Our next agenda item is program design consultation, and Jess, back to you.
Oh, thank you, Kim. And is Katie here with us? She's online to, great. So I'm helping introduce, Katie as our new program manager who you have met before. Today has a pretty substantial agenda item prepared for your discussion around 3 different programs that are under development to roll out over the course of the coming year. You've heard about them all already, but they are at different stages of development. It's really important to bring them back to you to get your continued guidance from the various perspectives you all hold in supporting and touching and advising on our system as these programs continue to develop. So first of all, access centers. You've heard lots about access centers. These are the day shelters, the drop-in centers that already exist or are growing in their expansion of capacity and service to our community. So this program is well underway and has gone through lots of iterative discussions already with our partners and community members to advise. But we do have some key questions for you. You'll hear more about that from Katie in a second. Transitional housing is another. Transitional housing, of course, had a lot of feedback that led to its creation in our systems vision, and then also helped inform the capital NOFA that went out last spring. But we're also needing to now really hone in on the programmatic design of operating transitional housing. So some key questions to ask you here. I wanted to come back to this, Kim, when you asked your question about permanent supportive housing. Interestingly, transitional housing, when we bring it online next summer, probably it will be more than a year out, but we'll add about 120 slots. And those will be 120 slots that actually show up in our point in time count because it's technically accounted as shelter. So it's just another, like, we're expanding capacity, but also that number will continue to go up. And that's actually in some ways good news. But anyway, I digress. Thank you, Jen. And then the last is pooled funding. And this is our kind of our inside label that we're using right now on the team, but it's a strategic way of aligning resources to be much more readily available to cut checks to keep people housed and to cut checks to get people into housing to make it simpler for our partners and people trying to access those resources quickly across our system. But we have less resources, so we need to be strategic about how we're using those resources and who we're going to prioritize. So those are the kinds of questions that Katie is going to walk you through to help continue informing this programmatic design as these various programs roll out over the course of the coming year. Because it's really important that, frankly, we've gotten some feedback that sometimes this space feels like a checkbox space, and we don't want that. And also that's not the purpose of all of your very valuable time. So Katie's presentation is brief, and the hope is that it elicits a lot of discussion so that you can help continue to advise this work, just as you did through the budget process, and we hope to have you continue to do as we continue refining and improving this system. So with that, Katie, walk us through your 3 programs and your big questions.
Thanks, Jess, for that intro. And I will note, thanks to staff who are here too in the Zoom room with me. Want to give a quick, before we jump into each program, kind of like what to expect from each of these different sections, overview of what it is and purpose of what that program does, then really looking to dive into the questions asked and for you all to give feedback. And then we'll end by talking about timeline for each of these 3 programs. So with that, if we could move to the next slide. So our transitional housing generally is kind of a longer form of shelter with supportive services to individuals experiencing homelessness. It is limited to not serving folks for more than 2 years. We launched NOFOs for 2 specific focuses in the fall: a recovery aligned transitional housing and then a behavioral health aligned transitional housing. Next slide. And really the purpose behind transitional housing, and today I'm really going to focus on the recovery alignment. We will be coming back to you all in the future to talk specifically about the behavioral health aligned transitional housing, but we have a much longer runway for that. The purpose of transitional housing is to provide kind of an intermediate step between inpatient treatment and permanent housing, recognizing that recovery is a journey and not something that happens kind of overnight. This one is really focused on recovery. It's partnered with clinical treatment as needed. So clinical treatment can come and operate, they can come to the transitional housing location, but they are not operating out of the transitional housing building in this case. So providing services on site as necessary, there will be peer-focused services, and really kind of thinking through what does that look like, but there is not going to be co-location of clinical treatment within the building. Our eligible referrals, kind of thinking through, they need to have a risk of homelessness. We are operating transitional housing. And then we have an income threshold. So population AB of 50% area median income or below that. So that will be required in this building as well to not be above that income threshold. And then referral sources are going to look a little bit differently than kind of our traditional shelter referrals. We anticipate referrals will come from recovery centers. So folks who have done inpatient treatment and are transitioning out of inpatient treatment and don't have a place to go, as well as homeless service providers who have recognized that an individual needs additional time in their recovery journey before moving to that next phase of housing and in the continuum. Next slide. So when we are thinking about referrals, that's one of the questions that we have for you all is, are there other referral processes that should be considered besides folks who are getting out of recovery centers or homeless service providers of folks who are already in that recovery journey and are really interested in being in a sober location for continuing that recovery journey?
Am I recognized?
Go ahead, Jen.
I don't know if
have a hard time seeing people in the room, so jump in.
I don't know how practical this would be, but coordination with corrections could be an excellent option.
Especially with the diversion.
Yeah.
They're sober
That's what I was
for a
thinking.
little bit.
Mhm.
They got no place to go. This is a prime population.
Can I ask a little bit more about what the relationship with treatment providers will be and what would constitute engagement with a treatment provider? Do they need to be engaged with a provider, or is it, tell me a little bit more about that relationship.
I think still in development, so I can give you a best guess and we will continue to evolve this. But the goal is really that this is a step down for folks who are in inpatient treatment, this would be a transition in that they would continue to engage with outpatient or groups or kind of depending on what the clinical provider is recommending, we're asking for them to continue to engage with that recommendation from the clinical provider. The hope is that the substance use treatment provider is the one who is recommending, and then the transitional housing operator is the kind of continuously following through with whatever that engagement in programming looks like from a substance use and treatment perspective. So that's going to be looking different depending on what the individual needs, but we're really leaning on that treatment provider to help kind of guide that path. The other recognition that we fully anticipate is that there may not be openings in recovery centers when a recovery bed is needed. And so what are the options for addressing that, and how does transitional housing fit into that space? So recognizing that the substance use provider may assess somebody and say that inpatient is best, outpatient is an option for this individual, and yet they need a stable place to do that engage in those outpatient services. And so if transitional housing is a good space for them, then that would be a referral source into this. Did that answer your, I think Adam asked that question.
Yeah, Katie, that was good, and I just like limited to 2 years with transitional housing, and as you mentioned, recovery is a journey, and there's gonna be folks that are on different stages of that journey and may enter this housing with the best of intentions and not be in the right place for their recovery journey to continue with treatment. And I think that those are always kind of the questions that I have is what then if folks are not in a place to consistently meet their appointments or consistently be engaged with treatment, like how do we support them in this and still be able to keep their transitional housing and not have the, I don't know, I'm probably thinking way too long term, but.
No, you're
that's
not.
just-
No, I mean,
Okay.
It's practical.
Yeah.
I think, Adam, those are all the things that we're also thinking about and we'll be asking the transitional housing operator to think about is what does that transition, if the person is not ready to engage in treatment, what does exit from this program look like and engagement with other programs in our continuum look like? I think one of the spaces that has been highlighted specifically from our partners in behavioral health as they've been co-designing this transitional housing model with us is it is really critical that we have folks who are wanting to engage in treatment because one person could disrupt kind of all of the programming that is happening on of everybody else's experience there. And so how are we working in tandem with that individual on their individualized service plan while simultaneously working with kind of the greater system of this is a location where substances will not be tolerated.
Katie, Rachel, I do see you, but I guess I apologize for my naiveness, but what inpatient beds will be referring to this? Cause that's a gap we have. We don't have inpatient beds.
Yeah, Rachel, let me jump in and then we'll come. So the Beaverton Recovery Center that's opening in November of this year will have 48 inpatient beds, as well as sobering beds and detox beds. And then one of the considerations is recovery beds. Are they required to be in Washington County to refer into that? Would love feedback on that. Maybe falls into one as well as two of if folks belong to Washington County, however we define belong, of if they want Washington County to continue to be the place that they reside, but got treatment elsewhere, Portland, Gresham, the Tigard Recovery Center as well has 16 inpatient beds. Are they able to stay at the transitional housing space here? So, Kim, did I answer that question for you?
Yeah, my brain didn't, I didn't realize it was gonna be sober living. I wasn't thinking that way, so I'm thinking through for folks that, you said it, Katie, recovery is a journey. But then you also said that substance use will not be tolerated. And so that tension that's gonna happen there, but I do wanna go to Rachel because her hand was up.
Thanks. I just have a couple questions. One is, when you say homeless service providers, does that include coordinated Community Connect? Sorry, does that include that? Are they considered a homeless services provider? And then, yeah, okay. And then the other question, I understand why we would be really focused on recovery centers and homeless, that makes sense to me, but I also just wonder a little bit about like some of the work, like the opportunity centers that are serving people who are homeless, like the workforce programs where there might be people coming in who are, because the other piece of this is people have to get jobs. And so I wonder if there's folks who've already demonstrated commitment to employment and who then might be also good candidates for something like this. Just a thought.
Which also then goes back to Adam's point around the timeline with recovery is under 2 years, a reasonable expectation to be stable in your recovery and to a point where you can have income to get housed. just I don't think I have a question. I think I just said shit. Courtney. I apologize.
No, that's good.
Thank you all for that feedback. Want to hold space if there are other referral processes that should be considered, and also have us start to think about the second question here of how should referrals be prioritized? And if you all have thoughts on that.
Just one other kind of logistical question is that folks often come with substance use disorder and behavioral health disorder, and often they're not well managed to have both, but many people do. If folks are experiencing, like, are dually diagnosed, would they be qualifying for the recovery or the recovery housing, transitional housing, or would they fall more on the behavioral health? Or are there going to be the ability to serve folks with dually diagnosed?
Yes, yes, yes. I don't have a great answer, Adam, but I think it is really identifying what is kind of the, I don't want to say more pressing issue, but kind of where are, from a services perspective, how are we addressing the services needed with the individual? So recognizing that this project is going to be more recovery focused, really leaning on substance use, while recognizing and treatment around substance use, and recognizing that co-occurring exists all the time. And versus the other one is going to be more focused on mental health and behavioral health. So two different operators, two very different buildings, both are going to have to serve co-occurring disorders, and recognizing that one may be a better fit, and really working with the clinical provider to determine which one is the better fit.
Well, I guess that can be connected to community connect, but child welfare or participants involved in the child welfare system, yes, that require, tenants over in order to reunify families, and they ended up homeless, waiting for that while kids are in foster. So maybe child welfare, like a pathway through that system for embedded community.
Great suggestion.
Holding space for the second question, if folks have thoughts on prioritization of referrals and any direction.
I really think like what Jim touched on with community corrections. For us, we get a lot of people referred through our programs with community corrections. And as like a lot of organizations have had to re-navigate what their scope is with the funding with Measure 110 and everything else that's happening in our landscapes. I think community corrections is a huge one where we get a lot of referrals, but if they're not in, so there's a lot of criteria that's been going along with it where sometimes we have to change different directions. So, yeah.
Okay, what else should we consider to ensure we're meeting the greatest need for transitional housing?
So Katie, did I hear you correctly that there will not be on-site services for like addiction and behavioral health?
Services will come to the building for a one-on-one support, but they won't be clinically co-located there. Part of the clinical co-location requires licensing, so they can't be operating out of the building 40 hours a week. So services will be on-site. Services will also in the transitional housing recovery focused building, group like peer groups, things like that will operate on site. Resident managers will be on site, but that really clinical one-on-one can happen on site, but majority will be happening off-site in a clinical setting.
Something we've learned along the way in partnering with our health and human services staff colleagues about the difference between what we think of around case management services and these clinical services, and how to create a recovery program and support that recovery program with those services on site, but also recognizing that a lot of the clinical services aren't gonna, that's not the role of the homeless services system. And also there's a whole other kind of body of legal governance around those kinds of services that, so we're still practicing the language as you hear me stumble over it. It's like, it's integrated programming, but we need to learn to be clear that we're not providing a treatment, like a clinical treatment program.
So the methadone providers will come every day to the building, but not be there all the time?
That's an excellent and very specific question.
Yeah.
Katie?
Jim, I don't have an exact answer for that. I think methadone could be provided on site. More likely than not, though, we would take folks to methadone as folks need methadone. The transitional housing operator, in partnership with their case manager, their clinical case manager, would help facilitate what does that look like? What does it look like in combination of also other programming happening? So if the person's going off site for clinical engagement, can we partner with methadone at the same time, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there is the possibility to have methadone come on site, but not required.
Can you remind me how many beds are in this? How many, what's the amount of people that we're looking to serve in this space?
Still in final steps, which I think that's a great transition to our next slide of timeline for this project. So programmatically, the RFP is getting released in July with contracting in September. And we are also currently working with the other side of the house, our real estate team, on the rehabilitation and what the building would look like. We're thinking 80 to 85 folks in the building, with a combination of also co-locating medical respite services. So those final numbers are not yet set, but we are working through that with the architect, and once the architect is on contract, because that it hasn't even finalized yet. And then we'll also be working through community engagement. Some conversations have happened in a very limited scale up to this point around the building, and that will continue all the way until this project opens. Project opening will not happen until most likely fall of 2026.
With all the budget reductions and potential even more reduction, where's the programmatic funding coming from?
You want me to take that, Katie?
Sure.
So, I mean, this is an ongoing discussion here with this body. Our budget will be an ongoing discussion here with this body. But the vision for, so that's I don't want to overspeak the answer to that, but the vision for how transitional housing came about was understanding the spectrum of housing services needed and the balance of that capacity within the spectrum. So we need shelter, emergency shelter, responsive to people who are newly homeless. We need permanent supportive housing, long-term permanent solutions, and we need these solutions in the middle. And rapid rehousing has been sort of the only solution in the middle. And as those of you who are operating rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing programs know, that wasn't always enough level of support for people who need places like transitional housing that's focused on recovery. So this is a long-winded answer to say, and we're constantly balancing out those levels of investments for all of that balanced system. And in order to insert transitional housing, we will be reducing capacity at those other places. What's been contemplated is both reducing some rapid rehousing and some permanent permanent supportive housing, ensuring we're meeting our goals and obligations to all of our funders, but scaling those other parts of the system down to increase this needed part of the system. And Medicaid, I would also want to say SHS is not and cannot be our only sole funder, and Medicaid will need to be a part of this, and that was what was contemplated in the beginning too.
One of the things I just mentioned with like the recovery center, then, if we're talking about ensuring Medicaid funding is accessible for these services. Katie, you mentioned peers, and peers are a really specific funding source that has to be either behavioral health or substance use disorder treatment. I'm sure you've worked with your teams at the behavioral health division on it, but like in order for a peer to be a billing entity, they have to be written into a treatment plan that is written by it's called a COA provider, and they have to have all the right things in place in order to bill. And so that means, though, that anyone who is in that center needs to have an active treatment plan and be actively in treatment. Otherwise, that peer will not be able to bill for their services. And so, like, that's where when you're talking about prioritizing referrals, it's really hard not to think about how you create longevity and sustainability in that with people who are actively engaged in treatment and actively engaged with the provider. And so I would say, I would encourage to look at a preference, like on how we prioritize referrals with those that are engaged with the provider that then can create sustainability for further programming and that can allow for peer supports to be engaged from the front end and be compensated.
Interesting.
Well, and as much as our supportive housing services measure is a volatile tax, Medicaid is a little volatile right now. So using it as this is what's gonna help fund it is, I think we're being overzealous in our current state. Just concerned.
Thanks for that. We actually are meeting with, we're setting up a meeting with Care Oregon to talk specifically about that and the nuances of that. It's almost like you were on our meeting earlier today, specifically on this topic.
All right. So,
And
Jenny got a question?
I have one quick question, maybe. When we talk about recovery and we talk about people with substance use disorder recovery, that's what we're talking specifically, right? We're not, because we know that the two are mental health and addiction services there. I mean, they're combined. When we talk billing, though, is there a way to, if the person is not one, can we bill without because they have to be on that
They have to be
plan.
on the plan written by the specific treatment provider for the specific intervention that.
So is there a possibility in this recovery house, transitional housing, for a person to enter it, signing that they will be sober, but they're receiving behavioral health services in recovery for their mental health? Does that make sense? So can we include, or are we only opening this center for substance abuse services?
Great question. I think we have been, I think something for us to talk about with our behavioral health partners, we've been really leaning into this focused on that substance use recovery, with the other project really focused on behavioral health, because our expectation is the operator here who would be doing those recovery services and be billing Medicaid would have the expertise of recovery services and not necessarily the Medicaid billing expertise of behavioral health.
And I don't want to make this an insurance
Correct, that's why I just
conversation,
wanted to-
but if we are talking about like sustainability and making a program that can last, I think these are just important things to consider in the process.
Okay, I'm gonna move us on and I will drop my email if you all have additional feedback, but we have 2 more programs and we are on a time crunch. So gonna move us forward to access centers. Services in our access centers are really targeted to folks who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness. But it is, services are regardless of enrollment or engagement in a housing program. So folks don't have to be connected to the rest of our housing services continuum. Our access centers are open 7 days per week, and they're strategically located throughout the region to provide services. In Tigard, Vernon just opened their access center. Hillsborough is in the works. Yellow House is already operating, and Kim is doing a great job with managing their expansion into a new building. We have awarded for Cornelius, although that is not yet open, will open in 2026. And then City of Beaverton forthcoming as we work through with them. Next slide. Access centers are that connection to our homeless services continuum. There are so many services available, and really recommend pulling Vernon or Kim to talk about all the work that they are doing in access centers. Basic needs, meals, showers, laundry services, helping folks get document ready. So birth certificates, IDs, social security cards, accessing mainstream benefits, so SNAP, WIC, TANF, getting enrolled in Oregon Health Plan, referrals to other community resources, community connect assessments, so getting through that phase 1, ensuring that folks are getting connected to the next part of the continuum of services, navigation services, and then inclement weather. As we activate inclement weather, that will shift to being in our access centers. So with that, I'm going to go to the next slide and ask some follow-up questions. And really the first question is, how are our new access centers being integrated into our homeless system effectively? And what do you all, I guess I will maybe piggyback onto the second question of who else needs to know about our access center? So how do we integrate not only into the services that we, of other homeless services in our system, but also folks who maybe are not as familiar with our homeless services system?
So I guess for number 2, the first one that comes to mind is, it takes me back to our TriMet days. They've got that safety response team. And so they were instrumental in helping make sure folks that appeared to be houseless would get off at certain stops that they need to get off at, and get them, even if it's by bus, from there over to an access center. Because we're still seeing a lot of folks not being dumped off at Elmonica anymore, but still riding on the train.
Yeah.
And so it's groups like that who are really trying to keep people out of the 911 system, including us. I mean, we can even use Uber to get someone to a place when they don't really need to go to the emergency room, but I can let our folks know, but law enforcement too, obviously, in there.
That's great.
But yeah, I would just think the safety response team has grown quite a bit too. And so they're gonna be great partners in helping get people off where they need to be, and that's.
Does somebody have to be engaged with the coordinated entry in order to access the access centers?
No.
No, so anybody can access it.
Very low barrier.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the whole vision is like, we need places for people to go. Right now, those places aren't the max, the libraries, and they should be purpose designed places for people experiencing homelessness. Yeah. This is the entry door into coordinated entry for many folks.
Well, and establishing the relationship with the providers that are running the facility too, because yeah, they might just pop in and out and not want to be in the system, but over time, they start
Yes.
establishing these relationships and. it makes
Right.
I can say that we're excited that part of the integrated system is all access centers are open 7 days a week for those 12-hour days, that consistency for folks, which, we haven't had for a multitude of reasons. mostly funding. And so I think that'll be really great, particularly for our homeless friends. But one of the things that we're looking forward to is not everybody wants to be at PHC. It's not the best fit. And so having our partner agencies to refer to is always great.
So I don't know.
Oh, go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. Oh, I don't know if this is silly or not, but like, who else needs to know about access centers in our community? I feel like there could be a little bit of education in terms of places like grocery stores. I think that there could be a lot of community outreach about where telling people where to go or giving people the tools in which to communicate to people who are at a grocery store or outside of one. And what I mean like grocery store employees, really doing that community outreach. And it's not just grocery stores, right? I mean, it's like a Target, it's like any chain stores that instead of just saying, hey, go away here, like, let's give them the tools to be able to say, do you know that the center exists? And then it spreads, right, to other people in the community. So if employees know, then they can help direct. I don't know if that's silly.
It's not, and then think about all the places that have security, like I've got a
Ross.
Walmart right
Yeah.
by my work, and there's security constantly driving around, and
Right.
it's a lot of the same security companies throughout, and
Yeah,
yeah, they're the ones that are kicking them off the property, whereas instead, maybe they can provide
That's great.
an
alternative.
alternative, so.
Great suggestion.
Okay, cool. And then it's positive, right? So
Yeah,
that
yeah,
we're
positive.
communicating with our community in like positive ways, saying, hey, it's not just negative, like this is where we're trying to provide access for all.
I'll just add to that I don't think there's any inappropriate person or organization or anyone that would be inappropriate to share about access centers, because you never know when people, wherever they may be, that may need to have access to something such as our access centers. So I think wherever you can meet people to provide them with the information about where we are and what we're doing in our various access centers, I think that's definitely a positive and a win-win. Because sometimes we limit our, where we want to communicate and basically advertise about what we're doing to certain situations, but I think it should be unlimited in terms of who we speak to, who we engage with, and who we invite or make ourselves available to.
We'll move us on to the last question. If folks have any thoughts about what else haven't we thought about, or what are we missing? What have you not heard about that you have questions about?
I'd be really curious about figuring out if there's a way to have the access center, the folks who work at the access centers, access our case conferencing space, and work with Nathan if there are folks that are having unmet healthcare needs that are showing up regularly, like how they could get access to that space and hook them into it.
On it, Andy. Adam, so close.
Close.
I was so good. But I corrected myself in my head. Yeah, it was so close.
I was actually wondering about, access, how accessible access centers are for folks with kids, so families, especially right now. We've all seen the increase in individuals that are experiencing housing hardship, houselessness, but then there's also a lot of families that are going through that, and a lot of them are, doubled up with relatives, for example, but at least here at Hillsborough School District, I've seen a lot more increase in families staying in hotels, motels, staying in their cars even. And so things like, a microwave to heat up food that they bought because they don't have a kitchen to prepare stuff, laundry services, that kind of thing, connection to medical services, they're looking for those resources as well. And I mean, individual school districts and organizations like Home Plate are limited in the things that we can provide just because our focus is other things. And so places that are more tailored towards that, resources for people with housing instability would be great.
Thanks all. I'm going to move us to, we still have one more program, but before we get there, I want to talk a little bit about timeline. We have contracts begin July 1 for 2 of our access centers, and development is underway for both Hillsborough and, 2, Tigard and Hillsborough in their current phase, and development's underway for their big building, as well as development for Cornelius. And then we're waiting, we're working in partnership with City of Beaverton for their next steps on their access center and what that will look like. All right, I'm going to move us to our last pooled funding, which is really 2 different programs in one program: move-in assistance and prevention assistance, really looking at homeless prevention. Move-in assistance is one-time funding. So really think about somebody has a way to sustain their housing after they get their housing, but they don't have enough funding yet saved up to move into that housing. So that is not only folks who have a job and are just waiting to move out of a shelter, or they're staying in their car, whatever that may look like. And they just need that $3,000 check, get through security deposit application fees, as well as all of our housing programs. So right now, all of our housing programs individually pay all of those fees. And so how do we bring that into one and cut a check quickly and get that out to folks? And then on the homeless prevention side, recognizing that we've been doing eviction prevention for the last 4 years since COVID, and even before that, and really moving into, because of our budget constraints, how do we target financial assistance and short-term case management to keep people in their housing who are at imminent risk of housing, and yet targeting the folks who are at highest risk of becoming homelessness. It is different from that traditional eviction prevention because we're trying to balance that they can sustain their funding while also recognizing that they need this funding to get over the hump and are most likely to experience homelessness. And so combined budget of $4 million broken down, $1.5 million on that move-in assistance, 2.5 on the prevention assistance. Next slide. Really the goal of this is centralized financial management. So be able to quickly cut checks, clear and consistent access across providers. So other providers will be referring to this agency to get the check cut. So anybody who has a contract with us in the homeless services system will be able to access this funding to get that check cut. And then we're strategically adapting to our current budget realities. So we know that we've had so many conversations with you all about budget reductions and recognizing that we need to target assistance to folks who are highest need, while also recognizing that available funding from year to year, and also recognizing that continuing to keep folks in shelter or kind of in that short-term solution when they have the ability to sustain long-term is better, not only for them individually, but also as a system to be able to move them quickly into that permanent housing that they can sustain. Rachel, I saw your hand up. You are muted.
I keep going. I don't want to start talking till you're done with your presentation.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Next slide. So this will have one organization that is responsible for both sides, both move-in assistance and the homeless prevention. Referrals can come from outreach teams, shelter and housing liaisons, as well as our housing programs. While those non-financial supports of housing navigation, application support, all the logistical support is going to be coming from that referring provider. So the referring providers, as they currently are doing, are helping determine where the person is living, what apartment they're leasing up, talking to the leasing agent, all of those things. And this pooled source will really be the person who's writing that big $3,000 check. And those smaller financial supports still are coming out of the provider's participant assistance funds. So those are still those small $100 fees. I know they're not small, but like they are not the $3,000 check. So kind of thinking about this being the bigger check of the two different pots of money. So I broke this into two separate questions, some on the move-in assistance and some on the homeless prevention. So starting with the move-in assistance, what factors should we use to assess if a household is able to sustain that housing independently? So really the goal of this is we are writing that one check and then they are able to sustain. And so if folks have thoughts on how we should assess if that household is able to sustain.
Can I ask a clarifying question? Actually, can we go back a slide? Thank you. So this one organization that's doing this work, does that also include for the on behalf of SHS programs? Like, so do our case managers have to get checks to move people in from this one organization?
Our long-term goal is yes. The goal is going to be that we are centralizing this, and then when we need additional move-in funding for folks, right now we have pots of money at every single organization with 31 plus pots of money. And so the goal would be that this is kind of very quickly. The other thing I'll say about this program structure is that this is a really quick turnaround on check cutting. So when we release this RFP, that is kind of the goal, is that this will be a really quick process where check can get cut quickly and that we always have available funding for folks to be able to move into their housing.
So I just want to say, as and I feel like I am not super helpful during this meeting because like I don't have as much great experience to bring to the earlier part of the conversation. But we did talk about this already at work, and I am a little worried just because I can't tell you the number of times we try at SEPA to have a couple days where I sign checks. Otherwise, I mean, I'm always trying to manage how many times I have to sign things. Otherwise, I would spend literally 50% of my time responding to people who need things signed, it seems like. But sometimes like I have to sign an stop what I'm doing, sign a check so that staff can get it to the houser, the landlord where that person lives, or to the company that's renting that out. And so it just makes me a little bit nervous because it just requires already staff to get that, to drive it out somewhere. I'm just trying to understand how this is going to work, which is a separate question from what you've asked me. And maybe that's not what we were talking about today, but I then want to just put a pin in it and say, I really think that how this is operationalized could end up being really stressful for organizations that are doing the HCMS and rapid rehousing work and need the checks. That's all. And I'm not saying it's not hard for you guys to have to coordinate 31 different contracts with these resources, but it does make me a little nervous. And it's so hard to be on Zoom, and I have no idea like what people's facial expressions are. So hopefully.
Well, Rachel, to reassure you, I'm nodding along. That's really good and clear and helpful feedback for us to keep in consideration, because the objective here is efficiencies and simplicity for everyone. So we need to make sure that the pooling of funds doesn't take away from the efficiencies and the effectiveness you need built into your operations. So thank you for that.
Okay, well, thanks. And I'm happy to talk about this some other time, or it probably is a better time. So back to your questions. My response to that really is like, I just feel like we've really struggled as a system to really effectively implement rapid rehousing and pick the right people who benefit from a program like rapid rehousing, which is essentially folks who just need a period of time of assistance and then they'll be okay without that. And so I just feel like we've already, I think we're just struggling with that right now. And so we should think about what some of the struggles are and try to use that learning opportunity to do a better job of that with this move-in assistance conversation. Because I think that there's some of the shared attributes there, which is basically, somebody just needs a little bit of help, or they just need, they've already paid rent by themselves for a year and now they need 2 or 3 months of assistance to address a particular thing. It's my feedback, I guess.
Thanks, Rachel. And I think some of the feedback that you just provided does fall more onto the homeless prevention side. So I'm going to just carry that forward of if somebody just needs that 2 to 3 months of assistance to get them through and still have their housing, that they would really fall into that side. This is really like maybe somebody lost their job, they actually are experiencing homelessness, they're in our shelter, and they have not yet had enough savings to be able to move into that new place. I'm gonna ask my second question here is how should we prioritize assistance if funding is limited to new households moving in? And if folks have thoughts on that question. And if folks don't have thoughts and you want time to think and resonate, you all have my email and you all are more than welcome to send me thoughts and feedback after as well.
Hey, Katie, Jess,
Yes.
I mean, instead of one agency being the of all the pooled funding, why couldn't we break up the pooled funding to agencies that are doing some of that work already? Like you just brought up shelter. Why couldn't move-in assistance? I don't know. I'm just trying to think of a different, to Rachel's point, it feels like another, bottlehead, like another thing we have to do to get someone the help that they need. And I asked you last week, like, why is the county doing this? And your answer was great. You're like, because it touches 9 people before a check goes out. So that is not streamlined. So appreciate that transparency. But is there another way to think of this to get it to the agencies faster, better? I don't know what the right term is. And I don't necessarily have it all thought out, so I'm not giving you a solution here. It's kind of draft form, but maybe it's not just one pooled fund. It spreads across in some way. I don't know. I don't have it all. And then
Go ahead.
And just for my clarification, where does this funding come from? Was this already in our budget? It was just called something different, not pooled funding?
It's in lots of places right now. I'm sorry, Katie. Kim is looking at me, so I jumped in to answer.
Yeah. I can look at you, Katie. I can look at you.
It's okay. This is in our budget. This is also, as Janice just mentioned, it's in our budget in a lot of different places right now. And that is actually creating some inefficiencies of this fund that we can't actually spend it down all the way ever in our budget. But we also do have in our budget for 25-26, this was in our budget as homeless prevention. Previously, we've had eviction prevention in our budget and recognize that we don't have that. Part of the budget reduction conversations was we need to better target who is getting this funding. And so with that, I'm going to move us to our next set of questions because I'm just recognizing time constraints that we have here. To homeless prevention. So much more limited resource than eviction prevention that we've had in past years. And so really want to know how should we prioritize households to be served? These are folks who already have a lease and are at imminent risk, kind of what Rachel mentioned of that, like they've been paying their rent and are going to fall back into homelessness without this. And so how should we prioritize and how should we limit assistance per household?
So I guess this goes to my question. I mean, why, and again, draft form, but just work with me here. Particularly this homeless prevention side, what we've seen in rapid rehousing and HCMS, a little bit of PSH, like, is remove, right? We're moving people multiple times. And so I guess for me, there's a question, like we've reduced our flex funds so much that we're gonna be so tight and constrained. But yet you're telling me there's this money over here to prioritize people that are at risk of being homeless again. I'm not coming up with the right question. So can this be used to move someone that's been housed and just needs to be rehoused? Or does that go back to your question on who gets the first time assistance move-in stuff? It's both, okay.
Katie, I'm sorry, I'm jumping in. I think that to your point, Kim, we're preventing homelessness for people who we know are truly at risk of homelessness, which is gonna be someone who just got housed in one of your homeless programs. They might need to be either rehoused or provided assistance to prevent their homelessness. So you're sort of you're asking a question, but you're answering your question, which is, these are the folks you want to make sure we're prioritizing, is the people we've just housed and might need financial assistance to be able to stay housed one way or the other.
Right, so I guess then my follow-up question is why can't Project Homeless Connect just have that assistance available to keep them housed versus going through another entity to get that check cut? So we're specifically talking about homeless prevention in this case, I think. So that would be just my open-ended question is,
I
maybe?
think I like see this a little bit differently, is really the goal of this funding is that somebody can sustain the housing after. So part of this in the development of this is, what does that housing stability plan look like? And so I don't think we're specifically limiting it to not be folks who are on our housing programs. However, this is also looking at folks who maybe lost their job, got a new job, missed a month of rent, and will enter our homeless system for the first time without this level of funding.
Correct, but to my point, that means we're probably gonna engage them in outreach at our access center or in shelter. I mean, I just, but I saw a hand come up. Was that you, Vernon?
Yes, but Katie sort of speak to that, but I agree with you, Kim, as well, in terms of where we will engage, is important to be able to have that immediate access to just shorten the window of time that it would take to prevent let me just say, to keep them, to have the prevention from them going to houses. But do we also want to focus on, I think Katie mentioned it to some degree, that it sounds like sometimes we're waiting until people are housed and then are houseless and then housed before we start really talking about the prevention side. Whereas before they even get to being houseless, having emphasis on that level of prevention as well.
Yeah, so thanks, Vernon. I think you highlighted the difference here. The move-in assistance would be folks who have already entered. They no longer have a lease, no longer are doubled up. They are entered into our system. They're in our shelters. So folks who are using this homeless prevention services are not going to be in our shelters. They may come to our access centers and are looking for assistance, may hit one of our outreach teams, but they're still able to stay in that housing that they're in right now, whether that is doubled up, kind of whatever that may look like. So want to recognize that kind of that is the differentiating mark, is for prevention, they're able to remain in the location that they are or stay kind of safe in that space. Rachel.
Thank you. The one thing that listening to Kim and like listening to folks talk, I think there's this one question underneath the question a little bit, which is, do we use resources to expand access to additional households? Or do we think about where we've already made an investment and we want that investment to be successful, so we invest there with folks? I feel like that's kind of a philosophical question that's a little bit underneath some of the conversation that we're having. And of course we want it to be both and, but sometimes that there is like a decision or a balance to be struck there. And so I just wanted to say, I'm not saying I know I'm not going to say I know exactly what the answer is to that. I think there is this part of me that's like, we've made an investment. We don't, that's how I feel about affordable housing. When someone gets into affordable housing, we don't want them to lose that housing because we've already put all this effort to get people in there. We don't want them to lose it. So we're going to do what we can to keep them housed. But that's really different than saying, this is someone over here who hasn't had a chance yet to get any support at all. And, it's a balancing act for sure.
Rachel, I saw some heads nodding as you were talking. So I think that sentiment really hit. And again, I'll drop my email in the chat for folks to give additional feedback, but want to move us on to timeline. Next slide.
Adam has.
Sorry, just one more question, Katie. How are you gonna know if people are already pursuing like HRSN? For eviction prevention as opposed to this, and like. I think that would be something to really, I know HRSN is not perfect yet, but I think. That pursuing both of these could get really confusing, especially if both are approved and supported, then I think you'd have a challenge, so do you have thoughts there?
I don't have thoughts, but it clearly is something we should work through and work on. The folks that will be referring into homeless prevention are working in our system. So it sounds like, and Chris and Kisa, who are helping with this on our side of the house, are both on this conversation. And so need to think through like what is pursued first, and kind of making sure that that is in our screening tools to ensure that we have a correct air traffic control to the right resource for each person. All right, I am going to move us on because we are almost out of time, and I'm not the last thing on this agenda. We'll have an RFP release for the check cutting agency in August. We're going to continue to do policy and program development through August and even beyond that, contracting in September and then launch in January. We'll be coming back to you all to talk more about the screening tool for that homeless prevention fund. Most likely in June, but we will also be having a smaller focus group. If this is something that really interests you, please reach out to Kisa or myself and we'll get you added to that focus group that's going to happen in June. I will turn it back to Kim.
Okay. So there's, Katie, am I hearing there's more time before this RFP goes out to flush this and potentially shift and, okay.
Yes.
Great. The next thing is our consent agenda. All the materials were sent to you in your email. And we're just looking for a motion to approve the consent agenda items. Indicating the approval of the system performance measures reviewed by the performance evaluation subcommittee is before us. And I will accept a motion to move the consent agenda forward to a vote.
So moved.
We have a move by Jim. I need a second.
I'll second.
Second by Christina. And then for the vote, I need a all in favor in the room or thumbs up or hands up online. We are actually taking a vote here. If you would like to abstain, please just let me know. And then we know that Stacy is absent. I'll look around the room for some hands.
I'm ex officio, so I can't vote.
Thank
So I have to
you.
abstain.
Okay. Online, we got a whole bunch of hands. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. So we have an all in favor and the motion has passed. Next item in our last few minutes are staff updates.
So, so I was gonna make a quick suggestion since we're running really close to being out of time. Would it be great if we could just do updates by email? Does anyone want to sit here for it? We can do that, totally. Is there anything that you just wanted to?
I was
like,
gonna, Nicole wrote me excellent talking points to give you all things on the updates, on the legislative updates and federal updates, but you can catch it all in the news. Note the state budget forecast just came out and it's not looking hopeful. So that's a challenge in front of us as well. But I was thinking, Nadia, the next slide has all of the committees and just invite anyone else who wanted to report out from any of the various committees they're
Yeah,
responsible
there were a few
to.
folks here that I know that had some of those.
I can do the TCPB. We met yesterday. And what we discussed, we review the committee review training implementation strategy for housing service workforce regional. And strategy aims to support professional development for the debt service staff, center racial equity and cultural responsiveness, and always, improve retention and competences through all organizations serving our community with this funding. So we discuss how should we involve in the curriculum development and what support needed for frontline staff to participate. So we provide ideas. They have two key implementation areas that they're proposing. One is a credential pilot in partnership with Portland Community College. So they did an extensive research of what's out there and how this can be implemented with a certificate or what's the name? I don't remember the name, but an on-demand training model also using content that is already there. So it looks promising for our service providers. That's it.
Hannah, have you had a lived experience meeting?
No, it is scheduled for the end of this month.
Great.
Yes. However, I will be in Florida for a work conference. So I'm hoping I can Zoom in depending on the conference and the time zone and stuff.
Great. I have Rachel and Jim, I don't know.
SHS Oversight Committee approved the Tri-County Planning Board talk about health service integration. Adam talked a lot. He made a lot of sense. Nicole talked a lot about the amendments that we had made here to the reduction, the Washington County plan. We reduced and they've made good measures to try to soften the blow of the reduction. And then there's finance reports and nobody knows how much money is coming in.
Rachel, would you have an update on the Metro President Work Group?
Yeah, we had conversations about governance. There's President Peterson has particular strategy for governance over SHS that she's interested in putting it in place. I'm probably not like the biggest fan of it. I think that I'm curious to see what happens. I feel like it's really mid-conversation still. It does feel like we're just talking about a lot of stuff without any closure on any of it. And the real issue is just, the longevity of the SHS funding and ensuring that it's there in the future. That's like the main thing to me more than any other conversation. So that's not a great summary, but we did spend a lot of time talking about governance.
Great. Abel, are you still here? Do you want to talk about McKinney-Vento?
Sure. Yeah, for those of you unfamiliar, when that's tends to be a lot of people. McKinney-Vento is a program at the school districts that support families and students experiencing housing hardship. And so we actually had our monthly meeting earlier today. And we were just talking about resources that are going to be available to families over the summer. So the school-based health centers and lunch bag locations. We were also looking at trends because we do have to submit our end of the year data to the Oregon Department of Education by June 20th. And numbers have so far more or less been similar to last year, but that's not really saying much because last year most of our districts exceeded even pre-pandemic numbers in total of unaccompanied youth students facing housing instability. And so there's still a high need. This year in particular, we've seen a lot more families that are living out of their cars. So that's something that we've been collaborating and providing supports to those people.
Thank you. And I don't, is BNF here or can anybody speak on hack?
I can email that update.
Perfect, thank you. We'll email a hack out. Thank you, everybody. Hello, buddy. Okay, I think we're good. Thank you for being here. We will see you soon. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
All right.